Hi, I'm Ethan, one of the hosts on the Green Room podcast. On episode 43, we were joined by two fantastic guests, one of whom is award-winning. We had Antonia Forster, who designed the world's first LGBTQ+ VR museum, and also Tolu Osinubi, who's part of our Proud at Deloitte network, leading on intersectionality. Together, we discussed how we can be better at amplifying underrepresented voices, how technology can help, and what we can all do to be better allies. We were blown away by how candid our guests were on this one. You can listen to previous episodes on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Enjoy, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop us a comment below, letting us know your thoughts on today's topic.
Hello and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte, a podcast where we ask tricky questions about the world around us. I'm George Parrett, and this is episode number 43, where we ask, how can we be better at amplifying underrepresented voices? Thank you all so much for downloading the latest episode of The Green Room. If you like what you hear, you can find all of our previous episodes on our website, which is deloitte.co.uk/Green Room Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. So today we're talking about representation and the role that business has and should be playing in making underrepresented voices heard. But joining me today is someone who never has trouble being heard. It's Ethan Worth. How are you, Ethan?
Hi George, it feels good to be back. Been a bit underrepresented in the last 3 episodes, so it's nice to be back at the mic. And yeah, we have 2 very inspiring guests joining us to talk about what is an incredibly important topic. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's a nice big topic, but yeah, let's stop wittering away. Ethan, who have we got in the studio to help us tackle this one this week?
So this week, George, we're joined by Antonia Forster. She is a senior virtual reality and augmented reality technical specialist at Unity, an award-winning diversity, equity and inclusion consultant. And she's also an international keynote speaker with a decade of experience. She is the director and producer of the world's first LGBTQ+ VR museum, winner of the New Voices Award at Tribeca Film Festival. Welcome, Antonia.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the lovely introduction.
Oh, you're very welcome. Very impressive bio.
Thanks.
We're also joined by Tolu Osinubi. She's a senior manager in Deloitte's quality and test engineering practice, specializing in large-scale, complex digital commerce programs in the private sector. Tolu leads the intersectionality pillar for Deloitte's LGBTQ+ network, Proud. She is featured on the Outstanding Future Leaders List 2020 and 2021 and was named Diva Magazine's Diversity Champion of the Year 2021. Welcome, Tolu.
Oh, thank you very much. Really glad to be here today and looking forward to the discussion.
We also, just to kind of break the ice a little bit, get a mystery icebreaker question, which has just popped up in the chat. What is the worst fashion decision you've ever made?
That I've ever made? Oh, that depends who's asking, because I like my fashion decisions, but I guess other people might not. I used to be very interested in Japanese fashion, so shironuri is a very specific fashion where you sort of look like a ghost or a sort of drowned person. So that's probably the most extreme fashion I've participated in. I guess a lot of people would probably find that quite weird, but I don't regret any decisions because I think it's all creative expression.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely think about some fashion decisions when I made when I was a lot younger. When I look at I think when some of the memories pop up on social media, I think, oof, I might take that back. So I think sometimes maybe some of the interesting choices I made when I was a little bit younger with maybe very bright colours or very, I think very noughties fashion styles, which maybe should stay there.
They're making a comeback now, though.
Yeah, no, they are, to be fair. They are.
Y2K on TikTok is trending.
Yeah.
Like, people love it.
It is. But yeah, no, definitely.
Me and my friends were talking recently about doing a party where you dress up as you dressed when you were 15, and just looking back through some old Facebook posts, and I think they were definitely some similar vein to you, Tolu. That noughties fashion, the top man cardigan, the gel front fringe, and then the spiked up back of your hair kind of look. So,
I'm sure we can add some old Facebook photos to this to the show notes.
Oh God, don't do it! Don't do it. That's a threat.
I mean,
Hostile.
one of my regrettable faux pas was I was at uni, and I remember rocking around campus with just brown trousers and this sort of brown corduroy jacket. So I looked very brown for a good 12-month period, really. So I remember that. But I did meet my wife during that when I was wearing that, so that didn't put her off
couldn't
too
have
much,
looked so
which is
bad,
good.
could it?
Antonia, I could chat about our fashion faux pas for hours, but I think it's really helpful just to sort of learn a little bit more about yourself. But before we really tackle this week's big topic, we've heard your bios, we've heard a bit about your fashion exploits in years gone by, but just to help our listeners get to know you, could you tell us a bit about your background and how you found yourself, where we are, talking today and why we're here? Did you always see yourself doing what you're doing now?
Absolutely not. I didn't. So I actually started out in zoology and animal behavior. So that's what my degree is in. I did a master's degree in ant colony decision making. I'm very interested in insects and decentralized decision making in colonies and the kind of hive mind process. So that's what I studied. I went on to work in zoos and science centers. The person who says, these are the penguins, here are some fun facts. That was my job for quite a while. Really fun, but not very sustainable financially, unfortunately. Usually very seasonal work. You have to move around, so quite logistically challenging. I did a lot of speaking, so I have a long history as a public speaker. I spoke in museums and science centers and science festivals. Then I moved on to music festivals and comedy nights, really wide range of talking styles. And then I had the opportunity to do a TEDx Bristol talk. So for those people listening, I'm sure many of you are familiar with TED Talks, technology, education, design, I think is what it stands for. And they're basically inspirational, informational talks, and they're very high profile. I've always been a big fan of them. So to be invited to do one was fantastic. And TEDx Bristol is, I think, the biggest TEDx event in Europe. There was 2,000 people in the live audience, so really, really large. And my talk was around how people say that LGBTQ plus is, quote, not natural. And how that doesn't make any sense, because first of all, things that are not natural aren't necessarily bad, but also it is natural. We see it in nature all the time. And as a queer person myself and a biologist, I felt really well situated to address that idea. So I developed this talk and delivered it. But unfortunately, I had to come out to my family, which I hadn't done before, because it was such a high profile talk that there was no way I was going to be able to get away with that. So I did come out to my family. It unfortunately didn't go well at all. They responded really aggressively, really violently. I had to cut contact with most of my family, and I still don't have any contact with most of them to this day. And that left me in a very difficult situation, both emotionally, but also financially, because I was still reliant on my family, because I was in this seasonal, temporary, very precarious career. So I decided that I have to find a way to support myself. And I kind of looked at my options, and I decided that learning to code would be a really good way to do that. At the time, I was actually working in a planetarium in a science center, developing content for the planetarium in a special language called Digistar, which is specific to planetariums. So I decided to learn a different language that was more broad, that I could develop any kind of 3D content. So I just Googled 3D content, how do I make it? And I found this thing called Unity. I thought, this looks pretty useful. No idea what it is, but I guess I'll start learning. There's content on YouTube for free, so I'll start. After about 6 months of learning Unity and C#, which is the language that it uses, I became a professional Unity developer at a company called Ultraleap, who used to be called Leap Motion, who specialize in hand tracking. Again, I'm sure many listeners, if you're software developers, will be familiar with Leap Motion. They're fairly well known. And yeah, after doing that for just over a year, I specialized in virtual reality and hand tracking, taking my 3D skills from the planetarium, which was a 3D sphere, into the VR world, which is also kind of a 3D sphere of content, just virtually. And then after doing that for, just over a year, I got a call from Unity about a different role, and interviewed for that, and eventually got my role at Unity and grew into the role I am in now, which is a senior VR and AR technical specialist. So it's been quite an unusual journey, but yeah, really, really happy to be where I am now.
I mean, fascinating journey, and actually, there's a lot of, even though you've touched on lots of different roles and lots of different experiences there, Antonia, I'm sure we'll unpack later. There's a common thread there about communication and how information is delivered in different ways, which I'm sure we'll talk to. But before we get into that, Tolu, could you answer that same question? Kind of how did you get to where you are today?
Well, in terms of how I got to where I am today, a lot of things for me are centered around my identity, but also this. I think being very young, this feeling or pressure to have to split my identities and not necessarily feeling that they were cohesive. So I identify as a Black British Nigerian lesbian, and growing up in a British Nigerian household, those identities didn't come together, or there was a lot of pressure to believe that. So when I think about the way I navigated growing up, and also my family and also the workplace, was very much around how do I split these things so I can get fit into the various boxes, or fit in quotes, assimilate into those spaces. So I think a lot of my journey has been around trying to navigate that. So when I initially growing up, I was not out to my family for a very long time, because that was a very, very difficult experience, and comments such as you need to focus on your education, there's no room for boyfriends. They were right, no room for boyfriends, indeed, but maybe not quite as they thought. But equally, that did create a lot of pressure around expectation and also what I was meant to do. And I think that created quite a hostile environment to be myself, or be able to really understand my identity. But then when I sort of went through university and getting into the workplace, I had a very core want to say, I am going to be out at work, because it is very difficult to be in the closet at work, in the closet at home. So what I tried to do actually was have almost these split identities and navigate it in that way. So if I think about my career journey, it's always been very, I've been open. I work as a software test engineer, always worked in consulting for the last 9 years. I used to live in the north of England in Leeds, but moved down and joined Deloitte in 2017. But a lot of what I have done has been very much around I'm making sure that I can, certainly in the context of the workplace, step into my full identity and also tell my story. But then the journey around my family was a lot more slower. But then equally, what a lot of that was coming on that journey to be able to maybe reframe some of those experiences, which I'm sure we'll kind of touch on later, to where I am now, where there's very much this understanding of my identities actually come together perfectly, and this understanding of how they intersect and intertwine, and the strengths they give me, rather than maybe the perceived discrimination that I experience, but also maybe in quotes perceived weaknesses some people might say they bring. So that's something I've definitely had to navigate. But then a big core part of that for me has been about, how do I make sure that I tell this story and I'm very visible, so that people understand, that people like me exist and people like me are thriving. So that is why I do a lot of the speaking I do, so externally and internally within the firm, and around my passion around driving sort of inclusion, but in that intersectional lens. So I do a lot around driving our initiatives. So at the Proud at Deloitte network, our LGBTQ plus network, making sure we're centering and celebrating intersectional identity through events and initiatives, collaborating with other networks within our company, but also externally, because I think that piece is a really important part of helping sort of that awareness in the workplace of intersectional identity, and as a real focus for me. But also outside of that, I think it's very important around the visibility point around experiences of being a Black LGBTQ plus woman working in technology, for organizations to help them maybe work through some of those experiences, but share a lot of the learnings that we have done, so as a firm, but also with the work that I have done, so that we're in a place to be pushing for change and that cultural shift in a meaningful way. So that is what has really kind of taken me to where I am today.
And do you think, for our listeners, Tolu, you could give a very brief explanation of what you mean by intersectionality, and why it's important to kind of look at underrepresented voices through an intersectional lens?
Yeah. So in terms of what I mean by intersectionality, so I think it has become quite a bit of a buzzword, and it is something that is talked about a lot at the moment. But it was a framework coined by Kimberly Crenshaw over 30 years ago now, and it's very much around how we frame and also how we sort of contextualize how there are multiple layers of discrimination and also privilege that exist within a lot of societal injustice issues, and how we better frame those conversations. So when we talk about intersectional identity, the way I like to frame it is, if you look at someone like myself, when I enter into conversations and spaces, it would be silencing or denying my experience, not to fully embrace all the aspects of my identity, which I've talked about, being Black, British, Nigerian. I'm a woman. I work in tech. I wasn't born in the UK, so I moved here when I was 5. I'm an immigrant. So if I'm forced, or if I am treated in a way that silences or marginalizes any parts of my identity, we're not really fully appreciating the fullness of who I am as an individual. And that's why intersectionality or intersectional identities and that understanding is really important, because we will miss parts of people we know or people in the workplace by not really understanding that. So I think a lot of what I ultimately do is help people better frame that, so they understand that, and also the nuances that might exist in experience for people. So, for example, the experience that I will have as a Black British Nigerian cis woman is different to a white LGBTQ plus cis woman, because there are nuances in the experience, and that's why intersectionality is so important. But also the application of it in terms of conversations is really important too.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that.
It's fascinating to hearing the journeys, and I think we've heard how you both have got hundreds of awards, and which is a testament on some level to your both of your roles as role models for people who may be feeling that they're not quite represented themselves. But if we could just step back a little bit, I think you both sort of touched on it. But what was your motivation for kind of amplifying your own voices? I think in your respective lives. I mean, Antonia, you talked about how you just before you did that TEDx talk, which I listened to, and I'll touch on that later actually, because I learned
thank
some
you.
interesting. We'll talk about your rapping later, but I think.
Oh no, please.
but I think what was the main driver there, and did you have role models yourselves at that time where you thought, actually, that person, I identify with that person, I'm feeling empowered to talk about who I am?
Well, it's funny you say that, because in zoology, yes, I grew up watching kind of BBC natural history documentaries, David Attenborough, Charlotte Uhlenberg, which hardly anyone knows, is a female presenter who I really identified with, and I wanted to be like her. But I actually think I was really well suited to code from a young age, but I didn't do it because I didn't have any role models. So my dad is actually a software engineer, and now, having grown up, my brother is also a software engineer, but I just didn't know any women who programmed. I just didn't know that was a thing I could do, and it seemed very far away from my skill set. I've always really enjoyed maths. I love puzzles. I love logic. So it actually would have been a really sensible fit for me, and I think I would have enjoyed it from day one. I love languages, and to me, coding isn't really like maths or physics, depending on what you're doing. It's actually much more like German or French or Japanese. It's a language. It's just a language that you write with equal signs and brackets, but you're not solving formulas day to day. Usually, it depends what you're doing. You're just speaking to a computer. So I think if I had had role models that looked like me, I probably would have gotten into it a lot earlier and maybe had fewer struggles compared to the journey I did take. So yeah, I had role models in zoology, but really none in programming. And now I'm very fortunate to have a wide network of women in tech, but only since entering the field, I've really not had that. And I think that's part of what inspires me to put myself out there is I get a lot of messages from people saying that they've never seen anyone that looks like me doing this, as well as being queer, and I guess I look a bit alternative for anyone who's listening to this and not watching this, I have green hair and a nose piercing, and I guess I look kind of alternative. I also have ADHD. I'm not extremely vocal about it, but that's a really big struggle for me, as I'm very disorganized, very scatterbrained, and I struggled with that a lot growing up, and I've only had a diagnosis in the last year. So really sort of just still learning to come to terms with that and manage that. But despite all those things, and despite some of the challenges and hardships, I really want to represent that, you know, you can do this, even if you don't think of yourself as technical. I strongly disagree when anyone says they're not a technical person. First of all, I only ever hear that from women or people of marginalized gender. I don't really ever hear cis men say that. So I think it's a kind of fake concept that you have to be technical to do tech. Technical, the word technical comes from Greek, and it comes from technos, or technique. So basket weaving is technical. It is a technique. Arts and crafts come from the same root as the word technical. So to be technical, you just have to enjoy creating. And I think if we thought of it that way, people might not have such a barrier. I'm also very vocal about my coming out story in particular, because as queer people, we often hear three kinds of story. Either I came out and it went well, which is fantastic. We hear, unfortunately, news stories of people coming out and facing really dire and sometimes fatal consequences for that, particularly in other countries. My family are Greek Cypriot, and there's a really big stigma there. That's part of why I think I struggled so much when I came out. They're also Maronite, which is a small ethno-religious sect, and they have particularly kind of strict views on certain things. So we either hear stories that went well, went badly, or I came out and then it went badly, but later my family accepted me and I was happy. But we very rarely hear the story of I came out, my family never accepted me and probably never will, but I'm still thriving. And I think that's really important to represent, because that is possible.
And it feels like a lot of this, which I think a lot of the themes around this is about instilling empathy, I suppose, so that others who are feeling underrepresented can empathise with people who are further down that journey a little bit, in terms of being open about who they are and having a voice about who they are as well. And actually, Tolu, what I thought was really interesting, what you said about how in your identity in the business world, you couldn't, you didn't want to differentiate that from your personal life. So am I right in saying that your business identity kind of led the identity of where you are now? Is that correct?
I not necessarily that it led the identity, but it was more that I was, because of my intersectional identities, I had to, or I felt the need to split what they were, because I did not feel the safety, and it wasn't safe to come out at home, but in terms of the context of the workplace, I felt that safety that I could do that. So I think that there's the element, and I think Antonia would say the same, that there's sometimes with environments, a lot of it comes down to your safety or your psychological safety to do that in those environments. So we may all behave in completely different ways, and how we talk about identity or what we reveal, depending on how safe we feel. That's a big thing. And I think for me, a lot of it was very much around it didn't feel like an option to shut myself down any further than I already had in the context of home, that I needed that sort of escape, and also to be able to do that. And I think one of the things that really I think that has resonated around my journey, and also picking up on Antonia said some really important stuff there, that the idea of thriving, if you are constantly getting this reinforcement that you are not part of this or othered in some way, that takes a really big toll on your mental health and also you as a person. So thinking about for the both of us with our experiences, there's lots of times where there's the constant reinforcement that you are othered here, you are the only one. So whether that's walking into a meeting room and I observe that I'm the only Black woman in there, or I'm the only woman in there, or I'm the only queer, whatever, that constant reinforcement definitely takes a toll on you. And if we think about in the context of the workplace or broader society, if you don't see yourself represented, and it is something I say that you almost have to be a little bit of an optimist to think that you will progress or you will be able to thrive, because you don't see yourself. So a lot of marginalized people or marginalized identities, there's that element of you have to be in a bit of an optimist to say, despite not seeing myself in this situation, I am going to take up space primarily, but then also the next point on there is I'm going to take up space and thrive in this environment. So I think that there's definitely that aspect which I certainly use as a mantra in what I do from a technology perspective, but also when I'm talking about diversity and inclusion, because I think that's a really big part of it and why representation is so important. Because if I think about growing up, I actually did not think that it was possible to be a Black, British, Nigerian lesbian because I hadn't seen one. So I thought ultimately, what's wrong with me? Because I haven't seen this. But actually what it was is they do exist. Well, here I am, and there's a thriving community, but it's that thing of if that visibility isn't there, that makes people feel very much like they're on their own, they're isolated, and also there's no community to plug into to be able to, whether it's starting to build maybe more chosen family structures or just find somewhere where you feel like you belong, then you end up being very much sort of outside of that, which is why it's so important.
I want to build on that if possible, because I think it's absolutely so true that if you don't see yourself represented, you think, well, there must be a reason, right? Like there must be barriers. I'm not exceptional. So, and I think if you're marginalized in any way, you're quite likely to think of yourself as, not exceptional, right? We're not, because we don't see ourselves represented on TV and we don't see ourselves represented in games or as the main character, we often underestimate ourselves as well. So if we don't see anyone who looks like us, we think, well, there must be a reason and I must be subject to that reason as well. But it's also about how we present it. So I see a lot of places making efforts to get more girls into like science, tech, engineering and maths. But when we present it as exceptional, I think that's also problematic. So when we say now we're going to do a lesson on women in science, I'm like, well, that's really strange because you're not normalizing it. You're presenting it as, despite this hardship of being women, they still made it. And like, if you gender swap that, like boys can be anything, boys can even be scientists. I believe boys can be astronauts. It sounds bizarre. Boys can do science too. Like, of course, why comment? If you remark on it, it kind of makes it remarkable. I think what we need to do is normalize that representation and make sure we do have diverse representation all the time in all areas in an unremarkable way, that is normal and acceptable. That I think is really powerful.
Yeah.
And I was going to build something on the exceptionality point, and I think that is a really good one, and it's a really spot on point. But something that also happens when we're talking about that exceptionalism, when people give an example of, oh, we have representation, I'm being very arbitrary here, in music, and say, oh, look at Beyonce, or look at this one Black athlete, or look at this one queer person. It drives this idea of, oh, as long as we've got that one or this very, very exceptional person, and you have to aspire to that for there to be representation. Actually, what we should have is 50 Beyoncés and some other people who aren't quite Beyonce, who are who are also in there, and so on. So it's not just about that is the standard, or that would be what representation is. Because I often think, to your point around the getting people into science and maths, that we should have people who are absolutely exceptional, people who want to do it for 5 minutes, people who want to do it for 5 years, and so on, for them to be that true expression of representation in those industries.
Did you know at Deloitte we support social enterprises through our 5 Million Futures programme? One of my favourites is Luminary Bakery in London. They use baking as a tool to take women on a journey to employability and entrepreneurship, equipping them with transferable skills for the working world. Their letterbox brownies are incredible, and they even have a cookbook. If you fancy a taste, just head to luminarybakery.com or check out the show notes. Now back to our topic of the day. I think what's interesting is, Antonia, you talked about tech and about seeing women in tech and the importance of that. I guess representation comes in many forms. So is there anything that you feel about representation in a more behind the scenes kind of way? So is there any any way in which the tech industry or business in general could improve in representation from having underrepresented communities, providing more of the kind of building blocks or just making up more of the workforce?
Yeah, 100%. So we often think of representation as, speakers or people who are doing very visible work. But if you're in an organization, so one of my previous workplaces, I won't name and shame, but I was the only woman at the time who actively coded as part of her role. And I wasn't that good at it. So I was like, this is really strange. Why? I'm not some kind of exceptional person. Why aren't there more women around me? So I didn't feel I had anyone I could speak to who understood my specific cultural experience, because let alone, I don't know if there were any other queer women around me either. I didn't even think to look really. But there were certainly no other women there who were coding. And so when I spoke to the men, they would give me career advice, but that doesn't necessarily pertain to me. Like, be louder, be bolder. Well, I might be penalized for saying the exact same thing that you would as a man in this space. So I don't think I can take that advice necessarily. So that I really struggled with that. And it's interesting because they go hand in hand, because the more diversity, equity, inclusion work that marginalized people, whether that's, Black, Indigenous people of color or women or queer people, or people who are trans or genderqueer, the more DE&I work, diversity, equity, inclusion work we're doing, the less we have time to improve our technical prowess and progress in the technical space. So I really struggle with this because I find it very important to do both. And so I do try and do both. I basically don't sleep and try and make sure I'm very technically skilled and also doing the representation work. So it is difficult. There's a lack of marginalized people at managerial level. Getting that first managerial role is very difficult. And also in executive leadership, we often see an underrepresentation, particularly in tech companies, also in things like finance. There's certain sectors but even in sectors like fashion, where there's actually a female majority at entry level, there's still a male majority at the top. And it's really important to remember, I speak a lot on diversity, that diversity is not just the gender gap. There's this big problem where companies think hiring more straight white women is diversity work because there isn't a 50-50 gender balance. And that's not what it means. The gender gap isn't the only diversity work. We have to think about people who are neurodivergent or have physical disabilities, or people who have different socioeconomic backgrounds or come from different cultural backgrounds or different ages. There's lots of things that diversity means. There's a lot that needs to be done, both behind the scenes and in terms of kind of very visible representation as well.
I think that's really interesting, Antonia, and I might come back to you in a minute. But Tolu, you mentioned that you struggled on the visibility point. I think growing up, you didn't see people that you could relate to, and I wonder how do you think technology has played a role in that in the last couple of decades? I suppose where now social media, smartphone cameras, the opportunities to see and be heard. I think my guess is it's probably exploded in that time.
Yeah, no, I think social media has been an exceptionally powerful tool around that visibility point, but also around giving people more access to platforms, because I think, see, prior to the social media age, that was very much driven through who the media would curate as voices that should be heard. So now we're in very much that space where there is that age of disruption or disruptive voices. All you need to do is pick up your phone and click the live button and say your piece, right? But I think what I do see, if I think about it, is that for myself, that I've been able to better connect with, so more on a global scale, with when I think about role models or people who have maybe similar experiences or as myself. So if I think about it, one of the really amazing things was having connections to so a lot of LGBTQ plus Nigerian folks who are doing a lot of incredible work on the ground in Nigeria, where it is very hostile to be living as an LGBTQ plus person, but being able to connect, but also being able to hear those stories, but being able to see those amazing folks just being so visible and so powerful, and being able to share those stories. And I guess because that is due to social media, but then equally, one of the things that I definitely do think about the visibility point is even within the better access, there is still very much see challenges around the equity of that in the first place. But then also from a technology standpoint, the more and more we, if I think about conversations about things like algorithms and shadow banning and things like that, so even then, we're starting to see those maybe undercurrents of we will promote these voices over these voices because they're more commercial, in quotes, as I did there, or they are more the voices that we're more comfortable with. So I think even though we have the opportunity, we're not necessarily learning from some of the historical things we do around who we choose to promote. But then what I do think is also a powerful thing, which is and it's really amazing about the LGBTQ plus VR museum pieces, we're now in a position where we can document all kinds of history in any way, shape or form we choose to do it, but thanks to things like social media and technology. And that gives us such a powerful kind of democratizing of that, so that it's not just we have to do it in the ways we've been historically told. We can be innovative about how we document our history, and then it means the types of history are documented are a lot more varied, the stories, the people, the artifacts, etc., which means that we're in a position where things are going to be so much I think richer for future generations as we have it. But I think also, to me, when I think about it, that I just find it amazing to still be able to be learning about the more I guess experiences which have been erased. And when we talk about LGBTQ plus history, and a lot of it tends to be, unfortunately, a lot of the history for a lot of sort of gender non-conforming and black and brown folks as well. But I'm so grateful we're more and more in that position where we're unearthing and making those things more visible.
And it seems like technology is very important to that. So, Antonia, could you maybe explain the VR museum a bit more about, and how that came about, and the role that the virtual reality plays in sort of telling those stories and giving that giving those different voices a platform?
Absolutely. So last year I was reflecting on my own journey coming out. I only came out in 2017, 5 years ago. So it really hasn't been very long. And I was thinking about why that happened, how it could have gone differently, and how I could help maybe other people in that situation. And through my research, I found that the biggest predictor of homophobia, and particularly aggression towards people who are queer, is lack of exposure to queer people and to their stories. And so connecting people with LGBTQ plus people with their stories in any way you can is really helpful in combating that and encouraging empathy towards our community. And I think that goes for other marginalized groups as well, but my area of focus was particularly towards queer people. So I thought about how I could possibly do this, and museums hold a special place in my heart, partly because of my history in science museums and partly natural history museums as well, but also because they're a place where we preserve and celebrate the culture that we deem appropriate and elite. And they have, unfortunately, a very white, cis, hetero, mononormative, patriarchal history. So they tend to have preserved white stories, people who are gender conforming, mostly men, mostly people who are middle upper class. And there are obviously historical reasons why that's been the case. But I thought that technology could possibly disrupt this. And I wanted to see if there was a physical museum in the UK that was dedicated to queer stories. And I searched, and last year the answer was no, there wasn't one. This year there is a small one called Queer Britain in London, which is great, and we've been speaking with them. But at the time there wasn't any physical place to do this. And I don't have the economic resources or the connections that I would need to build a physical museum, but I do have the power to build one in VR. So I thought about how I'd do it, and I connected with queer people in my local community in the southwest of the UK, some in London, some in Wales, and one person in Ghana who I know through my TED talk that I mentioned. And we asked them, if you were represented in a museum using one object from your life, which object would you choose and why? And that was the remit. And people gave us a 2-minute audio on what that object was and what it meant to them. And then I collected the object, scanned it with a technique called photogrammetry, which is really interesting. You don't need any special equipment. You just use a smartphone or a camera and take pictures of it from all different angles, and then use software to stitch those pictures together into a 3D model. Then I worked with the co-developer of the museum, who is a friend of mine, Thomas Terkildsen, who I actually met through Twitter through doing this project. He initially gave an item to the museum, and then he became a really big contributor and now is very much the co-creator of the museum with me. He's based in Denmark. And we scanned these items, built this virtual reality space, and put the items in along with the audio stories. So there are 15 different objects and audio stories currently, and over 25 artworks, which are all by queer creators all over the world, which I solicited through Twitter and social media. And the stories are really varied. There's stories from people of all different ethnicities, different ages, from mid-20s to mid-60s, men, women, and genderqueer people. There are cis stories and trans stories. So it's really widely varied, which was very important to me, that I didn't just rely on my own bubble, because we tend to be friends with people who are a similar age, similar cultural experience, usually the same ethnicity, usually the same gender as us as well. So I really tried to make sure I worked with different organizations to branch out and reach people who I didn't personally know and who otherwise wouldn't be represented. So the stories are, the objects really vary from a pair of wedding shoes, which is my favorite pair, my favorite object, to a teddy bear, to a headdress, to a church pulpit, to a book, nail polish. They really vary a lot. And I realized as well, creating it, that I had my own assumptions about the queer community. So for example, I assumed that my journey was somewhat representative and that people would have trauma, might talk about challenges that they faced and how they overcame them. But actually, primarily, people chose objects of affirmation or joy. And that was really lovely to see. And a lot of people didn't choose to speak about being queer at all, which I thought was really interesting. All the stories are from queer people, but for many of those people, being queer is just one part of who they are. And someone chose, for example, to talk about OCD and how they were hospitalized with it. Someone else chose to talk about how they're half Nigerian, half British, and the intersection of being mixed race and being queer. So for some people, it was a small part of their identity, and for others, it was not what they wanted to have preserved at all, which I thought was very interesting. So
it's fascinating. Yeah, and we'll make sure we include all the relevant information in the show notes for this episode as well.
It's such an inventive way of telling those stories. I saw the bit about the wedding shoes, and I think it was a couple that had saved them in their long shot that gay marriage might be legalized, and then they actually got to wear them on the day, which is absolutely amazing. And I think that idea that the power of stories to influence is so important. And I guess, as well as telling the story, you also need people to listen to them. So what is it that makes you feel like you've been listened to?
When I speak or when I have conversations with people, obviously I think that there is very much a want to almost come back with something or a response right away with oh, I've got this, and this. That I think that when I really truly feel heard, it doesn't necessarily come through response. It comes through people's actions after. So a lot of it for me is what I see people physically do, because it is very easy. And I think we all get kind of swept away with, we can have lots of really good discussion about things. We're having a great discussion today about how to amplify underrepresented voices. But the real part of it is the action, that what are people going to do? What are they going to take away and say, right, the next time I'm in a position to give a platform to, whether it's myself or, I don't know, Antonia and or anybody else, it's like, I recognize that I'm in a position to be able to do that. I'm going to do that. Or I'm going to actually pause and have a look and say, actually, my colleague doesn't seem themselves. I'm going to try and have a very empathetic kind of, would you like to have a check-in? Or if you need your space, happy to give you your space. Or something along the lines of, another way I look at it is when we're talking about how we do the work or make progress, is I'm actually going to really listen empathetically to those voices and let them be the decision makers of what we do, rather than I know what to do and I'm going to go off and do my own thing. So I think those sorts of things is where I truly feel really listened to. And I think a lot of it I've said there is put around the actions people take. So I think that's the biggest piece for me.
I think that's really interesting, Tolu. And actually, I just wanted to touch on, I think, something you said earlier, you both said earlier, actually, about how the importance of safety in the environment you're in order to feel confident enough to be represented. And I mean, there's an important role for business there, isn't it? What can businesses do to provide that allyship and create those safe environments?
Well, actually, the point you made about allyship, or the concept of allyship, is such an important one. And again, another buzzword we talk about, and people are like, "I'm a fantastic ally. I wear rainbows," or our company switches to a rainbow logo in June, or I posted a black square in 2020. But actually, the job of an ally is a very thankless and long-term, sustained commitment. And I think we don't necessarily see that when people are talking about their role as an ally. And something I was going to talk about is so there was a report from Deloitte earlier this year in June. It was the LGBTQ plus inclusion at work 2022, a global outlook. And one of the stats that really stuck with me was it said allyship is fundamental to helping LGBTQ colleagues to be able to be out at work. 82% of the respondents in that survey said that genuinely helped them to be out at work. So allyship in its truest expression, and when it's genuinely done, is a really powerful tool. But what we need to do is make sure we actually understand what the responsibilities are when we commit to allyship. So that's making sure that we do give platforms to underrepresented voices. We take action rather than we just want praise for being an ally. If we are not thanked for our work as an ally, we also take that on, because that's just our day-to-day responsibility rather than something to be given a badge about. And also that non-performative piece of being an ally as well, and making sure that we're really committed to the idea, because someone described allyship as being partnering in someone's success. And I thought that was a very good way to characterize it. So it's very much, how are we partnering in people's success from underrepresented groups? And that's how you really, truly do that allyship piece.
Yeah, no, I mean, Tolu, this is music to my ears, because these were exactly in my notes earlier, that report and those stats. But actually, one of the other findings from that, so it works both ways. So it benefits the business as well, because I think in that study, 86% of respondents said that having a LGBTQ plus inclusion policy had a positive impact on them in their current role. So there's a kind of there's a dialogue there, isn't there? So it's obviously it's interesting from a kind of commercial aspect as well. So
I think from the commercial aspect, very much so. And the point around, so you said safety, so that having that inclusive environment builds that psychological safety for people, where they can do their best work and they can be more innovative, they can speak up, and they can really thrive.
Yeah, 100%. So I think it's very important to remember that allyship or diversity, equity, inclusion, all these buzzwords that people love to use, they're all really important. But I think it can be very dangerous if a company just says, okay, we want to help marginalized people, and don't distinguish between those groups, because the concessions or the things that you need to do in order to get more women in the workplace in a male-dominated workforce, versus getting more people who are neurodivergent, or people with physical disabilities, or more people of underrepresented ethnicity, or people of different ages. They're all going to be different. You need different policies to address those different things. So it's really important not to just say, we're allies to everybody. Great, like that's good, that's important, but that's not adequate, because you need to think very carefully about who is that person, who are you targeting with your policies, and what policies will be helpful. So some things might be listing pronouns is a really simple thing to do that is very queer inclusive. Making sure you use gender neutral language in job ads is very gender inclusive. Having unisex toilets, healthcare that includes things like affirmative surgery, mental health, because actually almost all marginalized groups are more likely to struggle with mental health. So that is that actually does help almost all groups. Making diversity, equity, inclusion work part of performance criteria is very successful. So making sure people are actually accountable for efforts and assessed and rewarded for those efforts, rather than it being something that is a nice to have, but actually an essential part of people's work, is really important. A very bold step that seems to be very effective. And making sure that people, especially managers, have adequate training and know the correct way to address different things, because a lot of managers will avoid these kind of conversations because they're afraid of getting things wrong, not because they're particularly hostile, but because they don't know how to be anti-racist and anti-sexist. They won't necessarily be explicitly sexist or racist, but we all have these implicit biases that if we're not trained on them, we fall into certain patterns. So yes, I think distinguish between the groups, make an active effort, train people, and hold people accountable.
And Antonia and Tolu, I had a feeling we were going to run out of time, and I think we've created some serious headaches for the production team. But it's been a fantastic conversation. I think we could chat for ages, but I have to wrap up, I'm afraid. So it'd be. Antonia, you touched on some really interesting points about what needs to happen, I guess, or what we might see next in all this down the line. I have to close with this week's big question then. How can we be better at amplifying underrepresented voices in a nutshell?
It's a difficult thing to put in a nutshell, but I would say make the effort to educate yourself. That's, if I have to wrap it in one sentence, it's that. Don't rely on people who are marginalized to educate you and be ambassadors. We do tend to do it, but it is not fair to rely on that. So seek out the literature. There is a huge amount of research and literature into how to help each and every marginalized group. So seek out the info and action it.
Love it. Knowledge is power. Tolu?
Can't do it in a very succinct way, but I think it starts with the individual. So what am I going to do to amplify the underrepresented groups, rather than the expectation of someone else will do it? It's like, what am I going to do? And then do it.
That was nice and succinct. Thank you both so much for joining us and for being so open. Really appreciate it, and really good conversation. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We'll be back next time with another big question. This podcast is produced by our very own pod squad and hosted by George Parrett, Lizzie Elston and Ethan Worth. Thanks to our creative studio for their technical support. Original music by Ali Barrett from our consulting team.